So now we've seen both sides. We've seen the command economy, where the government owns and controls all the resources, makes decisions for the whole country. You all get paid the same. You follow my rules and eat the ham sandwiches that I make. And the free market economy in Hong Kong, where you can make whatever business you want without taxation, without government involvement. Now we need to get to that middle, happy, healthy ground, the mixed economy. So, if you're not familiar with this graph on the right, you can take a look at my demand and supply lesson. However, the mixed economy tries to give us a free market in most instances, particularly of goods that are good for society, like merit goods, where demand equals supply. So what you want to buy matches what suppliers are willing to produce. And that middle ground where they meet here is called equilibrium, and that's the price in the market that both parties have decided on. And this moves all the time like the stock market. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down. This is just a snapshot in time of the average price people are willing to pay and the average quantity that producers are willing to supply at. Now, this is the definition of a mixed economy. It has both private and public sectors. So it has government-run businesses and private businesses. And they both make decisions about how to distribute resources. So the private sector represents this graph. Market mechanism. They will make what you want at the price you're willing to pay. But then we have the government that supply a lot of base industries that are really important to society. Think about gas, electricity, water, phones. Many countries' governments supply these goods for guarantees of safety and security. So let's move forward. An example is the United States. They have a big free capitalist market with lots of private businesses starting up. Think about ChatGPT as a new one. But also the government steps in when they need to. Next, Germany. Germany has a strong welfare system for those that are in need. For those that lose their jobs, they get well compensated. The UK as well, actually. Think about Canada. They've got a public healthcare system, just like the UK. Very, very useful for when you get sick or injured. This is the benefit of having a government to fix that free rider problem we talked about earlier. So let's watch this video about understanding types of economy.
Over the past few tutorials, we have been discussing different economic systems, but there's a common misconception amongst the public regarding the economic systems that certain countries possess. For example, you'll often hear that Cuba is a communist country, or that Denmark is a socialist country, or that the United States is a capitalist country. However, as we mentioned earlier in the series, all of those words are misleading. In reality, nearly every single country in the world has an economic system that blends a market system with components of government involvement. To better understand what that means, let's examine mixed economies. First, some review. A mixed economy is a combination of a traditional economy, a market economy, and a command economy. Sometimes the government steps in to guide the factors of production. Sometimes it's all about individuals and businesses. Sometimes it's even based on traditional values. But why does the government get involved in an economy? Simply put, because markets aren't perfect. Early free market proponents like Adam Smith believed that if it was simply left alone, a free market would create the most benefits for consumers and producers. They favored a laissez-faire economic policy, or a policy of just letting things take their own course in markets, without government intervention. However, even Smith admitted that sometimes government involvement was necessary. And ever since, government intervention in economies has increased for several specific reasons. First, certain needs in a modern society cannot be easily met in a marketplace. For example, how well could a free market provide a society with highway systems, or a military? It's a highly impractical notion. Second, most economists now argue that at least some sort of government intervention is necessary today to help lift up those in poverty. There is no perfect solution to fight poverty, but the goal of equity remains the same. For example, to help members of a society receive a basic education, governments in many countries provide public schools. Third, governments often need to play a role in an economy by protecting property rights. This means that politicians must pass laws and enforce laws to protect property. Generally, there are two types of property that governments try to protect: private property and intellectual property. Private property is property owned by individuals or companies, as opposed to being owned by the government or the general public. Intellectual property is any work or invention which is the result of creativity that one has control of. For example, a song is the intellectual property of the composer who wrote it. Fourth, governments get involved in an economy to make sure that trade remains fair. For example, a government may step in if there's a monopoly, where one seller dominates a market. And finally, governments need to fund public projects that benefit all of society, and they do this primarily by taxing individuals and businesses. A tax is simply any required payment to the government. We will learn more about the different types of taxes in a future tutorial. For all these reasons, pretty much every economist agrees that a mixed economy is the economic system that most strongly benefits a society. Again, this is why it's the most common type of economy around the world by far. When looking at a country's economy, it's most sensible to look at where its economy falls on a spectrum between a complete command economy and a pure market economy. Therefore, Cuba might be somewhere around here. Denmark might be somewhere around here, and the United States around here. Ultimately, however, the challenge is finding the balance between government involvement and economic freedom. To do this, every society must first assess its values and goals. We must answer difficult questions like, what are you willing to give up in order to eradicate homelessness? Or perhaps, what is the best way to tax citizens? To illustrate a mixed economy, let's see how a simple everyday transaction can shatter typical assumptions. Take the example of buying a gallon of milk in the United States. First, that farmer who owns the cows that produce the milk had to pay taxes. In addition, the United States Department of Agriculture regulates the dairy industry, requiring certain safety and sanitation standards. Next, before the milk is sold in stores, it has to go through the pasteurization process. In other words, it's illegal to sell raw milk in the United States due to the possibility of containing harmful microorganisms. Next, the company that pasteurized and bottled the milk also has to pay taxes, as well as the grocery store that sells the milk to you. And finally, you have to pay a sales tax to your local government when buying the milk. Such a simple transaction on the surface seems like the magic of a free market. However, behind the scenes, the government is actually quite involved. To what degree should a government be involved in an economy? There is quite a lot to discuss here, so let's move forward and continue examining this concept.
So I thought this video was a great explanation about government involvement. I've got an exercise for you now. Thinking of government involvement in the example we just saw, how much involvement do you think the government should have in these four things? Maybe pause the video and have a think. Right, the answer to this is different to everybody, okay? So for me personally, I think the government should have complete control of road building. There should be regulations about height, width, length. This is to ensure consistent quality across the country. And when you have a natural monopoly like this, it tends to be cheaper over time as the government become more efficient at building roads. Hospitals. Personally, I would opt for a middle range. I think it's important to have free public services for everybody, and that comes out of tax, like the NHS in the UK. But I also think people should have the privilege of being able to pay for private insurance if they wish. Private insurance often develops new technologies as well, which then can be used in the NHS later on, the National Health Service. Schools, I think having both is important as well. Public, so everybody can be educated. Private, so you can have development of techniques and specialist environments that may be able to be taken on by public schools in the long run. Some of my students hotly contested this, believing that there should only be public schools. It was an interesting debate. And there's no right or wrong answer. And land. In China, you don't own the land. You can own the building on the land, but not the land. So they can build a beautiful railway line all across the country. But in England, we own the land. So this leads to loads more difficulties when a government has an idea to expand an airport or something like that. So there's an important question then about land ownership. And that's quite a difficult one to answer for me. I'm still on the fence. A lot of caveats. Where do you stand? Moving forward. So the government does have a role in these societies. Like I said, they use tax money to pay for merit goods. They produce essential services. They can stop monopolies. They stop production of harmful goods, and the wealth is redistributed to the poor. All of these things can help a society develop while allowing a free market to exist, as long as the free market is involved in goods that are good for society. So, basic advantages and disadvantages. Pause the video, have a quick think. Let's go through it. First, advantages, like I said, essential services, hospitals, schools are provision. So the first one then, hospitals and schools are provided for. Great. Next, we have a private sector, entrepreneurs, businessmen, hiring people, building the GDP, have an incentive for profit so they can innovate. We've got lots of competition, so prices are low. Quality is high. Consumers have more choice. And when businesses go crazy and become monopolies, the government steps in and splits them up and stops them from being bad actors in society. What about the problems? Well, if you tax companies and entrepreneurs enough, they might move to another country. If you hand out benefits to people that do not have jobs, and the low-income jobs do not have a high enough base salary, people will just simply refuse to work. And this has been a huge problem in the UK for a long time, where there's an argument the government created a subclass in society of people that are born into a situation where their whole family live off benefits from the government, have no incentive to work because the extra money they get is so little, and they encourage their children to do the same. So in recent years, the government's tried to put a big difference between those gaps of benefits they receive and money they would get if they had a low wage paying job. It's also called the poverty trap. Also, the idea that if governments step in and try to regulate too much and control industries, it leads to so many gaps, it lowers competitivity, it increases prices, and could potentially reduce employment as well if the costs of production are pushed up so high by government regulation. So let's look at an exam question on this topic. This is an 8-mark GCSE exam question. So the question is, discuss whether healthcare should be provided by the public sector or the private sector. A good question, okay? Now, in GCSE examinations, basically, the mark scheme indicates that when you have the word discuss, you must consult both sides of the argument. So you go richly into one side and you explain why healthcare should be provided by the public sector. And then we break up the other side and say why it should be provided by the private sector. And then we give a conclusion as to which one you will prefer it to be provided by, or you'd like it to be provided by both. I personally think both have a space where they can provide it. So pause this video, have a look at the methodology I just mentioned, okay? You can write a very brief introduction. Okay, shall we have a look at the mark scheme? All right, this is the official published mark scheme for this. 5 marks why it should be provided by the public sector. What do they mean by this sentence? If left to market forces, it will be underconsumed. Meaning, if we only had private hospitals, that means you've got to pay a lot of money to go there. That means the average person would miss out. The average person that has an accident needs help. They might need that hospital, and if it's not provided by the public sector for them, they've got nowhere to go. So, if the government step in with tax money and provide this, all citizens in a country have a base level of protection. Very important. You see how they make a statement for 1 mark and then explain it. It would have a problem for funding. People would not appreciate it until they're actually injured. So there wouldn't be enough public funding for these things. Then we look at the bigger picture of the economy. If everybody is healthy, think about the PPF, the economy will be more productive. They'll have more working days and less sick days. And like I said before, this is just exemplifying the first point. If no public hospitals exist, the poor wouldn't be able to afford to go and get this treatment they desperately need. And then the next points are basically saying about the cost, how much higher it is, and how this can negatively affect the poor. So you can see here, there's more than one way to skin a cat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 ways to get a mark. Up to 5 for this side. So yeah, you can't only do a one-sided answer. Up to 5 marks maximum if it's heavily one-sided. Next side. Okay, why should the private sector provide it? Well, the private sector follows the laws of supply and demand, doesn't it? The invisible hand that I talked about. Whatever customers are willing to pay for, they will produce. But sadly, that might lead to some people missing out that have rare diseases. And the idea that in the private sector, there's lots of competition, which means they'll try to lower costs, they'll try to improve services, they'll do a lot of research and development to enhance their procedures and productivity, which could be way better than a public organization. So like I said, yeah, improve quality, cut out waste, keep costs low. And as we're developing this second point here, if we let private organizations pay for healthcare, the government doesn't have to worry about the opportunity cost. Every time a government spends money, there's an opportunity cost. If I pay for healthcare, I pay less for military, or I pay less for education, meaning the government will have more tax available to spend on other things. And classic point that negates the public sector. The public sector is very, very inefficient, and it's been famously inefficient for a very, very long time. There's so many statistics that show the same company operating in a country that is public and is private, and it shows a very strong statistical difference in profit outcomes. Public sectors are generally just less efficient because they don't have the same profit motive or survival instinct, because if they fail, governments can keep giving them money. Once you've discussed both sides of this question, you should make sure that you make a conclusion. Which side you agree with and why? I prefer to be in the middle. I think that public and private hospitals can have a symbiotic relationship where we use market forces for private hospitals, giving people what they want, where they can research and develop and make profits and develop the industry, but also we have a base level of protection for society from public hospitals. All right, that's it from me. If you want any resources or private lessons, just look below. Have a great day, and I'll see you again.